been with Aberdeen for 11 years, and the last 3 entirely focused on our climate change strategy and how we incorporate that into investments and solutions. So 3 years ago, I set up a climate change strategy group with all the asset class reps, and one of the really key drivers has always been to make sure that what we do is incorporated into investment decisions and investment processes, and that the asset classes are really on board and part of the decision making and part of developing our approach. And our approach, climate change approach document, actually, when we published that in 2019, was aligned with the investor agenda that Natalie talked about earlier. So the 4 areas of actions for investors around investments, policy advocacy, engagement, and disclosure. So more on that is available if you're interested on our climate change website. But today I was just going to focus on what the net zero journey and how we think about that as asset managers and some of the challenges and frameworks that can be useful there. So we joined the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative actually in March this year, really having thought through what does this mean in practice, you know, and we did not, and I think the risk that we're seeing today is, you know, who's not signed up to net zero, and the risk of just saying that to jump on the bandwagon is I think a real challenge at the moment. So for us, it was about demonstrating that support for the net zero goal and focusing on developing solutions for net zero and having them available and really understanding what would that universe look like, what would the performance look like, what frameworks can we use, and then proactively working with our clients, particularly those that have set net zero 2050 goals, to work this out together in collaboration and to understand how solutions with real world impact really look like. So on the next slide, where you can see what is the framework that we really use as a foundation, I would say. We can move on to the next slide, is the net zero investment framework that Natalie talked about earlier. So we contributed to that as members of the Institutional Investments Group on climate change. They have a Paris-aligned investment initiative, and so through a number of workshops there to contributed to this net zero investment framework, and it really is about that real world decarbonisation, and that is really difficult to actually show and evidence, because if you just focus on a carbon footprint, that's not necessarily going to tell you the whole story at all, depending on the types of companies and the types of industries and regions. But so therefore the framework actually looks at a number of different things, obviously decarbonising investment portfolios, but by focusing on decarbonising the assets within those portfolios by investing in credible transition leaders. So we've spent quite a bit of time developing an approach of how do we identify them, what data do we use, but more importantly, actively engaging with companies to understand whether they really are credible transition leaders in our view. And there are tools out there that help you with data, such as the Transition Pathway Initiative, the Science Based Targets Initiative, Climate Action 100+, Net Zero Benchmark, that help with the assessment. But that's the one category that you see here. So there's the 3 pillars. The middle one, increased investment in climate solutions that help the world decarbonize. So for example, those wind turbine manufacturers, electric vehicles, the solutions that we need for the transition across all industries. And that's really a lot about innovation. And one of the things that's difficult is to capture the avoided emissions from those solutions. I think the industry is just not there yet with standards and with data to be able to say, you know, that's the carbon footprint of the company, but these are actually the avoided emissions due to the products and services. So again, quite difficult to show that real world impact in reporting. But there we very much focus on green revenues in alignment with the EU taxonomy, and trying to use that as a first step. And also more actively trying to understand avoided emissions by looking at the company reporting and their activities. And finally, net zero stewardship with very clear targets. So actually focusing on, as I say, the assets in the portfolio to decarbonize and influence that through engagement, and have very clear targets and milestones. Again, there's frameworks out there that help set that, like the Climate Action 100+ benchmark. And then after a certain amount of time where we've seen insufficient progress, the net zero investment framework suggests selective divestment rather than divestment right up front. So these are the core components, and what that means in practice, when we look at the next slide, please, in terms of how a net zero aligned portfolio would look like. What you see here is a number of different colored bars. The blue and purple is the kind of fossil fuels and high carbon transition sectors, and of course they still have a certain proportion in the portfolio today, but we want to see that reduce over time till it gets to zero by 2050. And then the green and pink bar, the lower carbon transition sectors and the clean technology sectors, ultimately that increase over time until the let's say brown or dirtier, higher carbon sectors have transitioned, so that everything's in the green and pink bar by 2050. But that transition, it will require a lot of work, as I say, through that engagement and through working, pushing the companies and for the companies to decarbonize. And the rate of decarbonisation for net zero 2050 is very significant. So that's the other thing, that around 78% per annum approximately is needed to be on that net zero 2050 trajectory. If we think about the emission reduction last year due to COVID being 6%, and we need 7 to 8% every year, so even more than that without stopping the economy, it's really a significant challenge. But that's what we would need to try and have that forward-looking view. So one of the important things is that we try to think about developing portfolios where we don't just look at the carbon footprint today, but where we think it will be in 5 years' time, and therefore trying to use forward-looking emission trajectories. So where do we get these forward-looking emission trajectories from? I'll talk in a minute about our climate scenario analysis, because that's one of the tools that we use. Moving on to that, to the next slide, it shows you that another real challenge for asset managers and investors in general is that whilst we have many, many net zero 2050 pledges, when we look at the policies and the actions, and this is a picture from the latest Climate Action Tracker assessment from this month, just ahead of COP, saying most countries are far from being on track to meet Paris goals. And when we look at the policies that they have implemented, they're generally insufficient or highly insufficient. Despite the pledges, there's just not enough in practice. So how can we invest and allocate capital in line with net zero 2050 and push companies to do so when the policy environment is not there? This is a real challenge eventually in the longer term, when really there's some low-hanging fruit, and then we need to decarbonize the hard to decarbonize sectors that do need higher carbon prices, and they do need more policy support to get there. But that needs to start today. So that's why there's a lot of pressure on COP26, obviously coming up as well, to push those pledges into practice. So I've just got a couple more slides I wanted to spend on climate scenario analysis, because for us on the next slide, what we did over the last year or two is try and bring that forward-looking view into our thinking, and try to quantify it, and use different scenario pathways. So on this colourful slide, you see that we looked at a range of different pathways, all the way from at the bottom, the green one being one that aims to be net zero 2050 aligned, to one that is the top, the blue one, which is current policies, and not much more will be happening in terms of climate policy and where we expect to be there in terms of emissions and temperatures of 3 to 4 degrees. And so what we did in our own climate scenario analysis is we used some readily available off-the-shelf scenarios, but also more bespoke scenarios where we brought our own insights in on what will happen across different regions and what technologies will be driving these pathways. And ultimately, we ended up with a range of different scenarios. We assigned probabilities as well to these scenarios to come up with a probability-weighted average scenario. So what we kind of expect to happen at this stage, given where policy and technology developments are. And that probability-weighted scenario gave us a 2.4 degree outcome. On that basis, we can have a look at this results in an assessment of under that scenario, what is the impact on asset values today? And so if we look in the next slide, what you see is, for the probability weighted scenario that I mentioned earlier, we can look at all the different sectors and the dispersion, and actually see at the bottom for utilities, that was the kind of strongest dispersion, which utility companies would benefit from an energy, or well positioned to benefit from an energy transition. And you see a positive impact on their asset values in that 2.4 degree world. And which ones would be more the losers of that transition because they're not well positioned. And so this analysis has really helped bring that forward-looking view in. And there are, of course, limitations, and it doesn't, you need to understand what it's not telling you and complement that with your own active analysis, such as, for example, credible transition strategies. And this is the result of some economic modelling, integrated assessment modelling, that brings all the different factors of transition and physical risks together, and understands how companies' values may be impacted today, looking at the impacts of these scenarios all the way to 2050, and then discounting that to impact on values today. So this was a really interesting exercise, and we can also look at all the companies here and what the forward-looking emission trajectories are in these scenarios. And that's something that we can then incorporate into existing carbon footprinting and complement that with a more forward-looking view, and then further enhance that by incorporating our view of transition strategies. So I've talked through quite a bit there. I've got a final slide that just touches on the topic about what about performance of low carbon portfolios, and because this is often a question, and we have explored that in terms of comparing low carbon indices, as here seen in blue, to standard ones, and we're seeing that they quite often closely match that performance, and certainly not a view of having to give up performance to have a low carbon portfolio. And we've also done some analysis to look at how, if you create a low carbon portfolio, how much you need to deviate from the benchmark in terms of track and error. And because a lot of the carbon in a portfolio is very, very concentrated in a few names of high carbon sectors, you only need to deviate a little bit from the benchmark quite often to reduce your carbon quite significantly. So that's another thing to think about. I'll probably leave it at that. I've just got a final summary slide that says, the different things that asset managers do to help asset owners achieve the net zero ambitions, which is on the next slide, around quantifying the impact, shifting capital into climate solutions, and transition leaders engaging and influencing with working with policymakers and industry associations to drive best practice. So that's it from me. The very final slide has got some links to publications and resources that you can have a look at if you want to read some of this in more detail.